Hey there. So, in the intro of yesterday's Pick a Reflection, which was what is the hidden power struggle in your relating, I talked about how I had been dealing with my own energy on using this deck when the word vengeance came out, and I couldn't identify how vengeance would be active in me because I wasn't actively participating in vengeance. I feel like I knew better. And then how I dreamed about a person that I had taken vengeance against, years ago. And then that gave me the opportunity to work through the energy and balance it out. And I just simply said that and moved on and used that as an example in my intro. But I wanted to actually take that example as an opportunity to clarify why that is, how that's working for me, right? So at some point in my life, I learned that taking vengeance out on somebody was actually not very wise because it just meant that I was perpetuating the energy, right? And at an earlier time then, when I was starting to better my life, I made these decisions based on wanting to be good or bad. Well, really nothing is good or bad, but at that time, that's when I made the decision, right? I don't want to take vengeance on somebody because that's bad. I want to take the high road. So it was an intellectual decision that caused me to want to decide against doing that thing, right? Now, I want to point out that the reason why I still had to, all these years later, balance out the energy within myself, even though I had stopped doing it and made a decision to not do it and decided that it was not for me, was because I hadn't balanced out the energy. I hadn't decided that within a place of neutrality where I had forgiven myself and understood myself and accepted myself and loved the part of me who did that. Right? I made that decision by deciding that it was bad to do that. So I wanted to be good, so I would do it this other way. So thereby I still contained a polarity against that energy, because my whole reason for not doing it was because I didn't like it and I thought it was bad. Whereas when we neutralize an energy, when we create 0 point on an energy, the reason why we are acknowledging it in ourselves and then validating ourselves is because we want to accept that there is a point of view that understands why that works for them. And then and after we've done that, we can understand that there's a point of view that understands that it doesn't work for them. And that both are in existence and both are true. Everything that's true, the opposite is also true. Right? So this is how we create balance. So whereas I had decided intellectually not to pursue any types of vengeance on the simple premise that it was dumb to do, there was still parts of that energy stuck in my energy body. So intellectually I could decide something and it could still have that energy stuck in my body if I have not neutralized it, if I have not dealt with any feelings that were associated with it at the time of it happening and lodging it in me. So there was a reason I was doing it, right? There was a reason I was taking vengeance, and it was because I was feeling disempowered. I was feeling overwhelmed with anger and hurt, and I didn't know how to deal with those feelings or process them within myself at that time. So my mind came up with this idea to project it out onto the other person, right? Make them hurt instead. Now, even though I know now that's not an effective way, at the time that I was doing it, that was the only way that I could come up with, given the experiences I had, the energy I was dealing with, the overwhelm I was in, the level of maturity I was at. So until I'm able to see it from another place, that is a valid space for me to be in, right? There's no, it's not really bad, right? It didn't make me a bad person to make the decision to do something, which I now know to be something that is harmful, and I don't want to perpetuate harm, so I wouldn't do it now. But at that time, the mindset I was in does need to be honored. So that's why all these years later, vengeance had to come up in my dream to remind me to like release that energy from my body, because it was still stored there in my body, even though my operating system, my intellect, my mind had adjusted itself to behave in a different way. So when this started to come up to be healed, I didn't really notice it at the time, but in retrospect, I can remember there started to be little like pokes of feelings when somebody would be doing something against someone in like in my family, and I would want to like lash out at that person, just like internally a feeling would go, oh, don't fuck with us, that kind of like wanting to like really put them in their place. And then like I would just go, oh, no, we don't operate like that, and like just kind of deny that was even there, like not be present with it, right? Until I had that dream, and then I knew, okay, this is something, and I've got to look at this, because I know for a fact that I did take vengeance in that particular instance where this person was being brought to my awareness and consciousness. I was in full awareness that I had done that. So it was an example that my psyche could use to kind of remind me, like, hey, this is still in you. Remember when it was in you, like, real live, and you were doing it and stuff? Well, there's some remnants here. So that's what was able to clue me in to kind of like go, oh, okay, yeah, that is there. And then, to be able to be present with those feelings and understand those parts of me and love myself through those feelings allows that energy to neutralize. So now, my first thought is not going to be to take vengeance on somebody when they're harming. My first thought is more like, oh, that person must be in pain. Like it's more of a compassionate stance that happens naturally by way of neutralizing the energy. So that's the difference. The other thing I thought might be worthy of sharing was I posted a couple days ago a video that talked about living longer and happier. And then last night I was watching the show that I think I might have even mentioned in that video called Playing House, which was mildly amusing and entertaining at times. But last night's episode had one of the main characters, getting breast cancer, which is not so funny, But it's interesting because, like, cancer is another thing where it's already been solved, it's already been healed. It's just that information has been suppressed and denied by an industry that's trying to profit off its sick people, which is a tragedy. And imagine, trying to live in a society where this, and then there's all these people who are like buying into this like awful kind of stigma and heaviness of cancer. And what cancer is like when cells turn rogue and they don't work with the community of cells in your body anymore. They're just like out for themselves. Like, and that cell will be making its own tumor or whatever, and though that cancerous cell has just turned against the community of cells, it's no longer taking into consideration the highest good of all. And actually, if you look at our society, that's what a lot of people have done. When we turn against others, when we decide that we are every man for himself, that's cancer. So when it manifests in our bodies, it's really just like as above, so below. Like it's just a reflection of the hologram that's happening here amongst people. So cancer cannot survive in an alkaline body. And this is something that is not talked about, is not shared. I mean, alkaline body is created when you are eating fresh greens, raw greens. When you're not cooking your food. That's alkalinity. What's acid? Acid is most of all the processed foods, all the meats, anything cooked is probably going towards losing its alkalinity and coming into acidity. So, and that's not to mention all the acidic products we put on our bodies. Nail polish. I mean, sugar is a big one. Sugar is a real big one, okay? Because sugar not only is affecting us in the acidic kind of realm, it's also like literally attacking brain cells and like dumbing us down and stuff. So Anyway, I'm not saying that we can't program ourselves to overcome it. Maybe people have been doing that. I have not been successful in doing that. My body, the model that I'm running at this point, hasn't been upgraded to some sort of like, I can bypass all of the needs for nutrition state. I have to really pay attention to it. And even though I've experimented a lot to try not to have to, because I like processed food sometimes. But I can tell you that's only since after 2 years of having let it sneak into my consumptions, because when I was eating clean, when I was eating alkaline, I had no interest in processed food. In fact, if I would have had a bite of processed food, which I occasionally might have if I went around my family or something, right, and they had something and it was like, oh, I used to like that. It's been 2 years since I had anything like that. Let me take a bite. It just wouldn't taste good anymore, right? So 2 years of cleaning my palate and that processed food is not even appealing anymore. So it's interesting how we acclimate, over time of letting that stuff in. And maybe, I don't know even how it started happening for me, but probably, I don't know. What was it? It was just kind of, like I said, it snuck in, right? I'm not really like aware of a turning point where I said, oh, I'm just going to let myself eat whatever. But it must have been just a time where I said, I'm going to let myself try this. You know what? I'm going to let myself try this and this and this. And then it just got to a point where I was like allowing myself to put processed foods in my grocery cart, where I never even used to shop the inside aisles. It was the produce section for me. That was basically it. Potatoes was the cooked thing that I would eat, and then a lot of salad. Although I would eat like tuna fish on my salad, like I would still eat fish. So anyway, I want to talk about the fact that like there are illnesses out there. Okay, so we can heal ourselves, and I figured maybe I should just share my own story, my own example of this, because I can say it all day long and tell you there's the information Dr. Bruce Lipton shares, but like also I have done this. I actually was told that I would die from autoimmune hepatitis. And so an autoimmune disease is the doctors basically telling you that your own body's working against itself, which is kind of a form of cancer. In fact, the drugs they put me on at the time it was happening were chemo drugs. And it was a very expensive prescription, $1,500 for a month of that prescription. And it was because my liver was failing, and it was because I was just toxified. But, I can tell you from retrospect that there are probably a lot of factors besides the fact that I had never... that I had been suppressing and denying anger in myself for many years. So I've said before that when we get illness, it's because there's a stagnant loop of energy just staying in our body, right? And it's stuck there maybe like as a trauma or a limiting belief or something like that, right? And if we're not paying attention to it, if we're not giving presence to the emotion that's lodging it there, it has to get louder to get our attention. So eventually it will manifest in some sort of illness. And Louise Hayes has done books. She's now passed on, but she's a spiritualist who released books about the metaphysical correlation to illness and what it could be correlated to as far as like your emotional issue that you were ignoring. Because it will usually, like whatever that part of your body does, it's probably going to like correlate to the issue in the emotions. Like knees can be like you're unable to move forward, or feet can be you're unable to like stay stable, like it doesn't have to be exact, we are still personalized people, so you have to kind of take the meaning that's appropriate for you. But basically, this has all been known for a long time now. So anyway, my liver was failing. I was diagnosed with autoimmune hepatitis, and I was turning yellow. I was in a lot of pain and all that kind of stuff. So I was put in the hospital for a couple weeks to be stabilized, and then they released me, but then I went right back into the failure. I was on all kinds of steroids. The steroids were actually making me feel worse. It was hard to breathe, like the whole issue was really not improving. So back into the hospital for a couple more weeks. So it's like a month of hospital time on this issue for me. And this is like before I really like understood my spiritual journey or anything. It was maybe right way in the beginning and something that really helped me towards it. So I left the hospital on medications, on steroids, no longer on the $1,500 prescription of chemo drugs, because that was what I was sent home with on the first try, and that didn't help. So thankfully I didn't have to buy that more than once. But then I started to get some other symptoms. Of course, this is probably a result of the fact that I hadn't resolved the energy that was in me, but also like now I was adding in other pharmacological substances that were messing with my system and taxing my system that was already taxed out. So on the level of my emotions, yes, I had never processed anger, but on the level of what that meant for my physical body is it meant I was not treating my body very nicely. I was feeding myself a full diet of processed foods at that time. Like all the things I was eating was processed foods. And I definitely wasn't even eating to excess, but I was obese. I wasn't active at all. I was sedentary. So the toxins that my body was holding were immense, and it was starting to affect me in other ways. And I had to call the doctor and tell them about those symptoms as well. And the doctor basically told me, well, we don't handle that. You're going to have to go to another doctor for that. And this was the liver specialist that I was going to. Hematology, I think it's called. That might be blood. I don't know. Anyway, it's been a while. So they sent me to another doctor. And when I went to that doctor, they gave me conflicting advice to the first doctor. Like the first doctor said I needed to be on a liver transplant list. And they said to definitely not take Tylenol, ibuprofen, and things like that. They didn't want me on things that tax my liver. But the second doctor was telling me to take those things. And I was kind of like in that moment thinking, gosh, these doctors they're not trying to save my life. Like they don't have a solution for this. And I was feeling pretty sad and desperate at that time. And, maybe I just kind of was talking in my head about these kind of questions and these inquiries and realizations I was having. And at some point I must have asked for an answer. And because the universe answered me by putting in front of me a documentary that was airing on Netflix at that time called Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead. And this is where a gentleman by the name of Joe Cross does juice fasting, and he travels across the United States while he does juice fasting. And he does this because he's severely in some sort of autoimmune attack of his body. Like he's really effed up from the autoimmune disease that he has. And he actually ends up healing himself of the autoimmune disease. Inspires others to do it, and at least one other man heals his autoimmune disease by juice fasting. And this is just drinking fresh juiced greens and some fruit juices. And that's it for 60 days. So I see this documentary, and I also may have watched like other documentaries on food at that time, maybe something called Food Matters. Food Matters is a documentary where they're talking about the fact that cancer's already been healed, where they're talking about the fact that the foods that we're eating and the fact that we've industrialized food is such a crime, and that actually the healing is already there for us, but it's been suppressed by a system that's trying to make money off of healthcare. It's just really corrupt. And so what happened for me was like I was experiencing that. So when I watched those documentaries, that made sense to me, and it was worth it to me to try this. And it was pretty radical for me because I had been eating processed foods. So I was like switching over and doing juicing. And I bought a juicer off my sister who had been gifted one, or I borrowed it at first and ended up paying her for it later. And then I would just be juicing all my meals, and I would get all these vegetables. I mean, I remember one time I juiced broccoli. It was the worst juice ever. And that really effed with me, right? Because it was like, I'm so hungry and now I have this broccoli juice. It's awful. But, nowadays if I'm juicing, I'm going to use a recipe that I know I'll be able to get down, because otherwise it's just not worth it, right? Like, why torture yourself? So, but at that time, because my body was just like really full of toxins, what happened as I juice fast was that I started to lose weight really rapidly. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know it until later. I came across John Gabriel, who is a specialist with weight loss, and the things that he shared revealed to me that what happens when we're eating a processed food diet is that our cells are actually starving nutritionally. So you could be filled up on processed food, but your cell is still looking for nutrition. And so when you have all that nutrition of the juice from juice fasting, now your cells are like, oh, okay, we can relax. Now we can release some of this fat. So the fat starts being released, but fat cells are also where we store the toxins. So in the first place, when we overload our system with processed foods, the system says, this is too many toxins for me to handle. My organs will fail if I try to process this many toxins through it, so I need to store this somewhere. I'm going to make a fat cell. I'm going to encase it in fat. So this is where you see like fat cells are forming to protect the organs from having to process too much toxins. So now as these fat cells are breaking down in my system, the toxins are being released, but my liver was already maxed out in its capacity to deal. It was already working too hard. So now I go into another crisis where I turn yellow again, and my liver is like, this is too much. And so my first juice fast, I had to stop, I think, after losing like 11 or 16 pounds. I forget. It was either that I lost 11 pounds and I went for 16 days of fasting, or I lost 16 pounds and it was 11 days of fasting, one of those. And I'm sure I have it documented somewhere. But anyway, I had to stop because my liver was starting to fail again. It was giving me the symptoms of turning yellow and jaundice again, and feeling sick again, because the amount of toxins I was trying to let it process was too much. So then I had to add in colonics, and I started doing coffee enemas. I broke my fast, first of all, and then shortly after that, I wanted to keep going, because here I was motivated to feel better now, and motivated to actually get the weight off of me as well. And so I found out about coffee enemas, and that's something that is actually used to help cancer patients as well, because it turns out that when you have all this kind of toxins that are now being released and it has to go through your liver can get really taxed. And so in the case of cancer patients, they're not always overweight, but still those cells contain toxins a lot of times. So the caffeine in the coffee actually helps the liver flush really quickly. Like the caffeine will kind of squeeze it all out in one whoosh, and then the enema lets it exit your system so that it doesn't get reabsorbed, because reabsorption can happen through the colon. So that's why we need to use the enema to help it like exit really quick before it gets reabsorbed. So once the coffee enemas were in place, I was able to resume juice fasting again. And, I ended up being very successful with it. And I got well on my way to being healed, and my liver stabilized and all of that again. And so during this time, I didn't know yet about like shadow work and things like that, right? Like I didn't know yet that I hadn't dealt with anger, and that's what actually put me in that situation again. So after I got my body recovered, there was still the risk for me to recreate that if I didn't let myself start feeling anger again, healthily. And fortunately for me, I did. I came to the understanding and realizations along the way. So I was able to then process my emotions as well. So for me, the physical symptoms actually took precedence and are the thing that got my attention. But that put me into the mode of healing. And once I was willing to like exit those toxins from my system, it was also a way for me to like start being present with my emotions. And while you're out, while you're like down for the count, sick, your body has no resources to go out and do anything anyway. You do have a lot more time to think and be with yourself and be present with whatever emotion arises. So what it was for me was that when I grew up in a very tumultuous household with my father exhibiting outbursts of anger quite regularly that were very scary, and that things got broken and there was a lot of screaming and there were, weapons and just really, warlike environment, that I was brought up in, I learned that anger was bad because anger was what my dad was acting in. And I didn't want to be that. I knew that was bad because everyone was scared and we would often have to leave, run away from him, go someplace else until he cooled down or whatever, right? And, or police were called or, who knows, all kinds of bad stuff happened when Dad was angry. And so I learned in that state of a child where I couldn't really comprehend, and it's not like people are explaining to me what's going on. Like this is just like survival mode here, guys. And my childlike mind decided that anger was bad and I shouldn't let myself be angry because that's who I would be. And nobody likes that person. Like, no, nobody's happy about that person acting that way in anger. So, I was quite old by the time that I started to let myself consciously feel anger and allow myself to feel it as a normal human feeling that people get to be present with and process through, right? Prior to that time, for most of my life since childhood, the only time anger would come out of me was in a very unconscious way through a rage trigger. Because I had anger still arising, and I had also made a coping mechanism that disallowed me to feel anger. Hold on, I just got to clear my throat. Ooh, that throat chakra is like, yes, let's get this out. So because anger is a human emotion that would still arise sometimes, but I didn't want to, and my coping mechanism said, no, we must not feel anger. I would feel powerless in that moment when anger came up in me because I wasn't dealing with it in a healthy way. My dealing with it was to deny it. And so when that happened, I would feel powerless, right? Because it was there, even though I was denying it. So I felt powerless. And the moment I deemed myself powerless, then the rage would come out of me. And I can remember like rage triggers were like, I see myself acting in a way that I know is inappropriate and I know is harmful and I don't want to do it, but I cannot stop myself. Why? Because I literally had deemed myself powerless. I told myself I was powerless with this anger. And this was also reminiscent of how I felt in the face of anger from someone else, from my father, right? I was powerless in those moments of his rage and anger. So I would kind of like realized this pattern after a while of experiencing anger in that way, and then realized, oh, well, I'm going to have to realize that I actually do have power, and I'm going to have to take responsibility back for myself in handling this. I do have the power to change this in myself. And once I decided that, then it was just step by step, easy to do, and just like allow myself to be present with anger. And I had a lot to be angry about. So I allowed it. But I also promised myself that I wouldn't act out in it because I was doing it consciously. I was powerful enough at that time to make the decision not to lash out to hurt myself or anyone else in anger. When prior to that point, that's what would happen a lot of times. And not that I would usually hurt somebody else physically, verbally for sure. And also I went through phases in my early like teens where I would, or late teens where I would break my own stuff. I stopped doing that. for the most part. But yeah, like I had to learn to process anger. And when I hadn't learned to process anger, it physically manifested in an illness for me to do so. And now, if I have a reason to be angry, I'll allow myself to be angry. And it's separate from vengeance, right? Because vengeance is that like thought like, ooh, I'll get you back. Like that's even more than anger, right? So in actuality, my dealing with the parts of vengeance that were still lodged in my emotional body is just an extension of me healing and dealing with and neutralizing anger feelings. And so now we see that it's been an ongoing process, right, of healing myself from stagnant energies of anger just because of it not feeling like a safe thing to me, it not being modeled to me. And then when I did become conscious of it and was willing to process it, that some parts of it just were hidden in my own subconscious. And that's perfect, right? Because like it's coming up now because now I'm prepared to do it. Now it was like a nothing thing for me to process that vengeance thing. And I say nothing because it wasn't hurtful. I didn't have to harm anyone. I didn't even cry. It was just a being present with and forgiving myself and just like coming to that place of neutrality and then realizing God's not judging me for this. It was only ever me that could judge me for it. And I don't need to do that because that's like a baggage and a grudge and a stuck energy that I don't want to carry anymore because I don't want to have to attract situations in my life that make me think, oh, I'll get you. Even if I'm just thinking it, like, and it wasn't happening consistently all my life. It was just that it came up more recently when vengeance was ready to be fully healed. So I wanted to really like explain all this because I feel like, if these things are happening for you, like just me sharing my point of view, my perspective, and how I've gotten to where I am and where I came from can only be helpful in comparison, but not that we need to compare ourselves to each other, but maybe, be inspired to do our own version of healing because like that is my version of my healing process. And like you have yours and it's separate, but like seeing someone else's is what inspired me, right? Like seeing those documentaries is what inspired me. And I didn't do the process exactly like they did on the documentary. And I didn't do everything they said on the documentary, but I took the parts that meant something to me, that made sense to me, that would help me, and I applied those. And maybe it was a little bit of this and a little bit of that along the way that got me to where I needed to be. And like, I feel like the process just unfolds perfectly for each of us. So it's not comparison in the fact of like, this is a race or like we're competing, but just like to see somebody else do something has enabled me to know that I could do something too. So that's why I wanted to share. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do for now. Maybe I'll do another reading in the next day or two, and I'll see you then.